Hey everyone, here we are all the way up to day 8, if you can believe it. So yeah, hopefully the exam went well for you. Working on getting those back to you. So yeah, so today we're going to be talking about banking and financial crises, right? So this is really material from chapter 12 of Michigan. And then there's going to be some other information that I bring in here. So we're going to be talking about, as I said, banking crises. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about the 2008 banking crisis and financial crisis and talk about what the causes there were. And then we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the potential ramifications of this COVID pandemic, right? Are we headed for another banking crisis here in the near future? So those will be some of the topics that we talk today about here on day 8. So let's get to the notes if I can find them. Sorry, don't have things piled up here as I should. It's really hard to work this around on my computer. Okay, let me try this one more time. Yes. Okay, here we go. So, banking and financial crises, the topic of the day. So when we talk about a financial crisis, we really could be talking about 4 different sorts of phenomena. We could be talking about an asset bubble, which we've already talked about. We talked about this on day 5 when we talked about stock markets, right? We could be talking about a banking crisis, which is what we're going to talk about today. We could be talking about a currency crisis. A currency crisis is when a country experiences a sudden and large devaluing of their currency. And then we could be talking about a sovereign debt crisis. In other words, a collapse in the market for government debt that prohibits a government from borrowing more. These are really 4 different kinds of financial crises or financial market crises. Usually when we say a financial crisis in general, though, we're talking about 2 or more of these things happening at the same time, okay? 2 or more of these happening at the same time. So today we're mainly going to focus on 1 and 2, right? We've already talked about 1, asset bubbles. Today we're going to talk about 2, banking crises, and we'll talk about how asset bubbles and banking crises interact. Tomorrow, we're going to talk about sovereign debt crises 4, and as we go on a little bit later toward the end of class, we'll come back and talk about currency crises, right? And so we'll talk about what drives all 4 of these different components of financial crises, and we'll talk about how these things are related to each other. So, the focus today, though, is on number 2 here, banking crises. What is a banking crisis? Well, banking crisis happens when banks cannot roll over their short-term debt and they experience disintermediation. By that we mean when people pull their money out of a banking system, that can trigger a banking crisis, right? Remember, as we talked about on day 6 on Monday, that banks borrow short and they lend long, which is exactly the kind of thing that you or I should not be doing, right? Most people want to borrow long and lend short. Banks do the opposite, right? They borrow short and they lend long. Banks are essentially borrowing every second because a lot of their deposits can be pulled out at any moment, right? So banks are almost borrowing second by second, right? Trying to ensure the confidence of their depositors so that their depositors keep their money in the bank. So what happens when the confidence of depositors disappears? Well, then banks no longer can borrow money, and that leads to a banking crisis, right? Banks are vulnerable to crises for 2 reasons here. First, as we talked about, they borrow short and lend long. So the fact that they have to be continually rolling over their debt, meaning borrowing every second, right? And maintaining the confidence of their depositors. That means that if they lose that confidence, the money can go, right? And once the money goes, they can't just cash in their assets and get money out that way, because most of those assets are lent out, and they're lent out for years and years, right? And it's not going to be easy to, those assets are not liquid. They're not things that a bank can quickly turn into cash. So banks are vulnerable to crises because they tend to borrow short and lend long. The other problem is that banks, as we talked about on Monday, are highly leveraged, right? Banks only hold a small amount of their assets as capital. So they simply don't have the resources to be able to pay back depositors if every depositor wants to pull their money out, right? They are highly leveraged, much more leveraged than almost any other firm in the economy. And this makes them vulnerable to a crisis. So as we talked about on Monday, banks, only have maybe 8% of all their assets available as capital. So if banks suffer losses on their assets of 8%, most banks are going to be bankrupt. They're simply going to have zero or negative capital, meaning they're going to be insolvent. And so you put these two things together, and banks are just very, very risky, right? They're very, very risky institutions by the very nature of what they do. So how are we to understand why a banking crisis occurs? Well, if you remember when we talked about asset bubbles, we talked about two kind of theories of why asset bubbles occur. One is that they're belief-based, right? That it's psychology that drives the asset bubble. And the other was that it was fundamentals-based, that there's actual real economic incentives that drive asset bubbles. Well, really, that same dichotomy between beliefs and fundamentals also applies to when we talk about banking crises. That there's really kind of two big theories about why banking crises occur. One of them based on beliefs and the others based on fundamentals. So let's talk about belief-based theories of banking crises first. And all these theories really focus on the fact that banking crises in some sense are self-fulfilling. So if you're a depositor and you think that a bank could go bankrupt, what do you want to do? You want to pull your money out now, because the key is you don't want to be the last person pulling your money out. You want to be the first person. So the thing is, even if you don't think a bank's going to fail, if you think other people think that a bank could fail, you don't want to be last in line, right? This leads to a self-fulfilling aspect of banking crises, that just the belief that a bank could fail is enough to cause a bank to fail. Because if people believe that a bank is going to fail, or even if you believe other people think that a bank is going to fail, you pull your money out, and all that disintermediation leads to the bank failing, right? Banks are also vulnerable to manias and panics. They're vulnerable to the boom bust theory, right? That banks tend to get caught up in the boom, and they lend too much, and then what happens in the bust? They're the first people to be defaulted on. One of the more, I think, insightful theories about why banking crises happen is by an economist by the name of Hyman Minsky, who has what's called the financial instability hypothesis. And Minsky thinks about banking crises from the perspective of how investors operate, right? The investors that banks lend money to. And so Minsky says, if you look at the beginning of a crisis, things usually appear to be okay, right? So in other words, when I say at the beginning of a crisis, what I'm really saying is before the boom, right? Before the boom, things appear to be pretty good. There's a lot of what Minsky calls hedged finance going on. And by that, I mean, if you look at the cash flow of firms, it's bigger than their debt payments, right? So firms have money coming in that's much bigger than their debt payments. And that's okay, right? That's good, right? The money coming in is more than the going out. Things look good. But then as the boom begins to catch on, what we see is that a lot of firms take on a lot of debt, right? As debt goes up, we eventually move to what's called Ponzi finance. Ponzi finance is really related to the Italian con man, I think his name was Charles Ponzi, who basically developed this scam by which he would attract new investors to pay off the old investors, and then attract new investors to pay off those old investors, and attract new investors to pay off those investors. No money was being made. It was just the attraction of new investors to pay off old investors that gave people a sense that, yeah, the firm was making money, when in fact, all it was doing was just taking money from other people and giving it to other people. And then, of course, a lot of it went into Ponzi's pocket. So what does Ponzi finance look like? Well, Ponzi finance is kind of the same idea, where as firms borrow more and they get these bigger debt payments, eventually they start to borrow just to pay those debt payments. In other words, the debt payments are greater than the cash flow. They're borrowing to cover their interest payments. So they're not just borrowing to cover the investment. Now they're borrowing to cover the investment and the service on that investment. And this is not sustainable in the long run, right? You can't borrow to pay the interest rate, right? Because if you do that, you're just accumulating more and more debt over time. And so Minsky thought that, basically here's what a crisis looks like. You have a boom and a speculation, and firms accumulate a lot of debt, right? And so what happens is that hedge finance becomes Ponzi finance. And that's where firms are very vulnerable. Eventually, something triggers a panic. And as soon as the panic hits, a lot of firms and a lot of investors freak out. Asset prices begin to fall. Banks begin to suffer losses as a lot of people can't make their debt payments. Leverage gets even worse because the value of assets go down, but yet you can't attract more capital. And so that leads to more panic selling, and aggregate demand begins to fall, and so people stop spending. That only heightens the sense of panic, and so there's more panic selling, and we get a vicious cycle, right? Minsky definitely believes that a lot of the phenomena that we talked about related to asset bubbles applies to banking crises. For instance, the "this time it's different" syndrome, right? Where the more that people think, well, this time it's different, so the old rules of finance don't apply, the more that thinking permeates the market, the more likely that you are to have a banking crisis and an asset bubble. There's also a lot of herding and greater fool psychology, right? Why am I doing this? Why am I buying this? Or why is the bank making this loan? Well, because if I don't do it, some other bank that's even stupider than me will make this loan, right? And there's also a lot of, if that person's doing it, then what do they know that I don't know? So maybe I better do what they're doing, right? That's the herding psychology. Bank runs are not necessarily irrational here, though, certainly irrationality can contribute to bank runs, but they don't have to be. A lot of the problem here is that we are all so tied together. Our psychology is tied together, right? It really goes back to that. We talked about the Keynesian theory about the beauty contest, right? When you're voting on who's going to win the beauty contest, you don't vote for who's most beautiful, in your opinion. You vote who you think other people think is the most beautiful. And that's the problem with bank runs, right? Is I may not think the bank is going to fail, but if I think other people think the bank is going to fail, then I'm going to act like I think the bank is going to fail. And that is not necessarily irrational, but it's very, very volatile, right? It's very, very volatile. And as a result, you can kind of get what we in economics call multiple equilibrium, right? You can have one equilibrium where the bank's going along, and then really for no real reason, you can switch to another equilibrium where the bank is failing, right? Because everybody pulls their money out. So that's the belief-based theories, right? That once again kind of focus on behavioral economics and psychology, right? And I think there's a lot to be said for these. Having said that, psychology doesn't have to be at the heart of a banking crisis. There's a lot of real shocks that can trigger a banking crisis too, right? By real shocks, I mean shocks that have nothing to do with psychology, but shocks that directly impact the balance sheets of banks and the profitability of banks. So there's many kind of shocks that could drive a bank into banking crisis that have nothing to do with beliefs. Let's just go through a few of these, and many of these we've already talked about. First off, financial repression, right? Many times governments regulate banks in a way that reduce their profitability. For instance, many governments require high required reserves, right? That makes banks not very profitable. Or many governments require their banks to hold lots of government debt. Why would governments do this? Well, because they're really using their banks to finance their debt, right? And we'll talk about this a little bit more, but this often happens in countries such as China, right? That China, because they don't have very developed bond markets, actually requires their banks to hold a lot of their debt. That doesn't make these banks very profitable, right? And that when you're not profitable, you're vulnerable to a negative shock because you don't have that cushion of profitability. Also, the potential worry about sovereign debt crises, right? We know that banks hold a lot of government debt. So what happens if governments begin to default on their debt? Banks are going to lose. And as we know, banks aren't really built to suffer big losses. They don't have a lot of capital. They're highly leveraged. This is one of the things that we saw during the European debt crisis is why, to put the European debt crisis in some perspective, Greece is as big a part of the European economy as Minnesota is as a part of the US economy. So how was it that a relatively small portion of the European economy led to such a big impact on the entire European economy? And the reason is because a lot of European banks held Greek debt. And when Greece got close to defaulting on this debt, while it may not have been a huge portion of their assets overall, even 2 or 3% of your assets, banks just can't suffer losses that big, right? And so, a sovereign debt crisis really threatened to spill over to the rest of Europe through this mechanism of a banking crisis, right? The fact that Greece was going to default on their debt threatened a banking crisis for all of Europe. We'll talk more about this tomorrow when we talk about sovereign debt crises and how banking crises are related to sovereign debt crises. Of course, sometimes banking crises can just be due to recessions, right? When the economic conditions get bad, defaults rise, and once again, banks can't suffer very big losses. We're going to talk about this a little bit later today, but of course, one of the worries here is, can U.S. banks survive what's this pandemic, right? Because obviously this is going to lead to a pretty good sized recession in the U.S. How ready are banks currently to weather the storm, right? And suffer the recession and suffer the defaults that inevitably are going to occur. Banks are also very vulnerable to unexpected inflation and deflation. And we've talked about this, right? That banks, the surest way to destroy a banking system is to have variable interest rates and variable inflation, right? Because unexpected inflation creates winners and losers. And so I won't go over this again. We've talked about this on a number of occasions, but banks can get screwed either way. Banks can get screwed when inflation is unexpectedly high because it eats their real return. Banks can also get screwed when their inflation is unexpectedly low, because while that increases their real return, it also increases the possibility that borrowers are going to default on them. Bank crisis can be driven by an asset bubble collapse, right? So when stock prices decline, people's wealth declines, and if their wealth declines, they may not be able to pay back banks, right? So this graph here is from your book, Figure 2, stock price data during the Great Depression. And you can see this is one of the things that contributed to the banking crisis during the Great Depression, is that stocks lost, what's the number there? I can't even read it. Basically about if you look from the peak of the crisis, the stock market peaked to the bottom. At the bottom, stocks lost about 80 to 90% of their value, right? That is a huge loss in wealth that really threatens to spike defaults. And then finally, spikes in interest rates, right? Banks have a lot of interest rate risk, as we talked about yesterday. And so when interest rates go up or when interest rates go down, banks are almost inevitably going to suffer losses because they borrow money short term and they lend money long term. Finally here, banks are vulnerable to exchange rates changing, right? Why? This is particularly in countries, less developed countries, poor countries that cannot borrow in their local currency. They have to borrow in dollars. And so what that means is that they have to be able to pay back money in dollars. And so what happens if the value of their currency drops? Then that means that the amount that they have to pay back in dollars goes up. And so once again, this can make it very difficult for banks to borrow money, extremely expensive for banks to borrow money. It can also mean that many of the people they lend to cannot make their payments, right? And so it leads to defaults and a crisis. And we'll talk more about how a currency crisis can contribute to the banking crises and that later. But certainly international banks that rely on a lot of foreign borrowing are very vulnerable to exchange rates flipping. All right, that's the end of section 1. Let's come back here in a moment and talk about how in the world do banks ever stay solvent.